Hello and welcome to our third and final pilot episode of Unreasonable Adjustments. So we made it, Dennis.
Yeah, we did. We made it, Shabazz. Welcome to the show, everyone.
Yeah, so we've got three or four items. And our first item is a pre-recorded interview with a campaigner called China Mills from Death by Welfare. Is that right?
That's right, the Deaths by Welfare project. So our theme this show is that we're exploring disabled people's relationship to the state. So I do need to give an early content note that we will be covering some sensitive topics that include end-of-life issues and abuse inflicted by the DWP. Our second item then, after China Mills, we're going to be sharing some messages from disabled people about creative responses to navigating state violence. So people are going to be sharing with us some of the arts that they have appreciated that's on this topic.
And then our third item is an interview by yours truly, Dennis. Is an interview that you're going to do for us live. I repeat, live with Vince Laws. Is that right?
It's the amazing Vince Laws, yeah. He's a disabled artist, poet, and activist. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I look forward to that. And then
we'll have Shabazz giving us our outro.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to that too. So first up then, we've got a wonderful interview with China Mills.
And for those who aren't aware of the project, can you give us a bit of an overview? What is it about?
I usually say I'm a recovering academic. I've been an academic for a long time, and part of the work that I've done, and I suppose the movements that I've been part of, has been, I guess you could call it, mad sort of activism, and around particularly looking at the way that state violence and connected to corporations, big companies, produce conditions of distress, and especially thinking about how that connects to suicide. So I've been part of like mad activism for a really long time, like grew up alongside family members who hear voices, and was part of the Hearing Voices network and then Asylum magazine. So I guess that's a bit of my kind of background. But the Deaths by Welfare project really comes from, I'd been involved for quite a long time with disabled people's anti-austerity activism, and also witnessed people in my own family just like torn apart by particularly the punitive policies kind of driven by austerity around welfare reform, and especially the work capability assessment, so assessing people who claim disability benefits in terms of their fitness for work. And I suppose that it's that led me to kind of want to do something more around this, start to change the narrative around it. And connected to that, I started doing some work with Healing Justice London a few years ago. So we started to kind of dream of what would become the Deaths by Welfare project, I guess. And then slowly since then, I have pretty much left academia and come to work at Healing Justice, leading what has become the Deaths by Welfare project. And so a core kind of part of that work has been the creation of like a timeline of evidence, but evidence on our own terms, of the connections between the welfare state and especially sort of post-2008 welfare reform and people's deaths. And I would say it was kind of very early 2021 and wanted to make this timeline because I'd heard from many disabled folks involved in anti-austerity activism that there was this need for like this bringing together of evidence. So I reached out nervously, because I was a big fan, to John Pring, who's a disabled journalist and the editor of Disability News Service, and has like over a decade of experience researching the impact of state austerity on disabled people, and said to him, would he join me? Would he fancy being part of this project and kind of imagining it together? And he wrote back the same day and said yes. And so since 2021, we've been co-creating together and with a lot of other people the Deaths by Welfare timeline. And so what that looks like is masses of evidence showing how the welfare system creates life-threatening policies that are leading to people's deaths and to so much harm. And we also show in that timeline that the government knows about those deaths and yet has continued to deny any responsibility or to make any systemic changes in terms of accountability for those deaths. And what I think something that's been really important about the timeline is it pieces together loads of different kinds of documents. So documents that are often like hiding in plain sight or like buried in bureaucracy. So like they are available on like the Ministry of Justice website or hidden away, and you can find them, but you have to know they're there. And so what we wanted to do is really bring that all together with like responses from to freedom of information requests, prevention of future deaths reports, politicians' speeches, and bring that all together to really start to identify patterns. And that's important because you don't see those patterns if you only look at those documents individually, and that's how the government, if they do anything at all, tends to kind of investigate people's deaths, is they treat them as like individual cases rather than connecting them to sort of much bigger patterns of state violence, I suppose. And yeah, so we're at the stage now with the timeline where it's about to launch this year, 2023, as an accessible and much more interactive website. And we've worked with Access Power Visibility Collective to create that. And it's taken like a whole community of folks to make it. So many people, too many people for me to name, and also lots of people who have to remain anonymous because of ongoing threat and reality of the violence, particularly from the Department of Work and Pensions. in their lives. But we created a version of the timeline. We released it for sort of a public consultation. We got tons and tons of feedback, mostly from disabled people. And then we took that and created what it currently is, which is absolutely kind of mammoth database of evidence, I guess, which really like speaks to, and I think in some ways makes visible or helps us to sense that sort of slow violence of government policy in relation to, especially to disabled people. So the way that like there's often a time lag between when a policy gets introduced and then the kinds of harms that you start to see, and people's deaths.
I think the fact that you tapped into that as a community of people that has made it is really interesting, especially considering how multifaceted the project is. You've got a podcast, right? And you've done artist commissions, and you've got an exhibition that's coming up at some point. And I was hoping you could explain to us a little bit about why that approach is being taken place.
Yeah, of course. Oh yeah, there's so many pieces to the project, and it's kind of taken us on just so many different journeys, which has been really beautiful, actually. And I think what our thinking behind this is that there are so many different ways to tell the story of the way that the welfare system harms people, or of like welfare state violence, I suppose. That we wanted to make sure we were exploring those different kinds of narratives and telling that story in different ways. So yeah, we've got a podcast sort of series. So there's about the fifth episode is about to come out, the Deaths by Welfare podcast, and that's available on the Healing Justice London website, and various other places. And that really centres lived experience and the analysis that comes from lived expertise. So every episode is in conversation with people who have lived experience of navigating the welfare system, and also of experiencing distress and suicidality in relation to that system. And we try and do in that also something that's really, I think, important to our kind of strategy in terms of finding existing as well as creating opportunities for like cross-movement solidarity. So one of the newest episode of our podcast, which is about to come out, is a conversation between families bereaved by different forms of state violence. So some families who've lost people to the welfare system, and then others who family members have died in connection with policing and the criminal punishment system and mental health system. And I think what that does through centering people's lived experience in that way shows the way that those forms of state violence are connected, and also how powerful it is for folks to come together in terms of solidarity across those different forms of violence, because they do connect in so many people's lives. I think also what has felt really important to us is around like narrative and kind of the importance of narrative change in the work, particularly because narrative and the stories that we've been told by the government and the media about folks who claim welfare, and particularly about disabled people who claim benefits, has been such a powerful, like dehumanizing, just horrible story. And it's been incredibly successful, actually. So many people believe it, so many people internalize it, it lives in people's bodies, it gets enacted between us all in our communities and our families. And so we really felt the need. That's why narrative change and kind of different ways of telling the story are important to us. And I think we all are really familiar with that. We don't need me to repeat that sort of story, but that kind of, talking about disabled people who claim benefits as being kind of undeserving, etc. We know the sort of dehumanizing language that we that we see. And again, that exact, very, very similar language gets used to describe different groups also in relation to welfare state violence. So particularly undocumented folks and asylum seekers, again, providing a really, I think, important connection between people who get labelled as being burdens on the state and how that functions as a cover story to justify dismantling welfare and social safety nets and to divert what are public resources away from poor people and particularly away from racialised and disabled people. So yeah, we really wanted to change the narrative around that, I think, and particularly to really put forward that, no one is a burden, no one should be defined by their relationship to work, and people's dignity and worth are non-negotiable. So I think that the timeline is like a sort of counter history to that official narrative, and a kind of also a way of, that's what I should also say, the timeline also shows just the incredible like genius, creativity and brilliance of disabled people's organising around austerity, different forms of activism, some forms that are kind of quieter, like submitting freedom of information requests to the government, others that are much more like led by direct action. But it really, that's also a massive part of the story that we tell in the timeline, is disabled people's resistance in exposing the way that the government is responsible for people's deaths.
I wanted to ask you if you could briefly tell us about some of the challenges that you've experienced so far in the project. You've spoken a bit, understandably, about some people's need to be anonymous, about the fact that when you're working with people who are in the experiences and at threat of violence, that it's real life that we're dealing with, right? And that there can be consequences to action and to resistance. But I'm wondering, in terms of your position as someone who's leading this and coordinating this, what some of the challenges that you've faced in that position has been.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, okay. So there's been tons of learning for us, and there continues to be. Quickly, though they deserve longer than this, I think there's been, right from the beginning, real tensions around how we honour people's lives and individual people's deaths, but also at the same time try to hold like the scale of harm, so the sheer number of people who have died, but without also just talking about numbers, right? Because all those deaths represent people's lives. I think a big thing for us has been experimenting with how we sort of talk about the brutalities of the system, like of the welfare system and the government, particularly that kind of slow bureaucratic violence that's so much part of the design of the welfare system. So how we expose that and talk about it, but without actually reproducing it in our project. And so that has meant paying a lot of attention to processes, like we pay all the disabled people that have been co-creators on and involved in the project, means paying people quickly, being flexible in terms of how people are paid because of benefits, etc. Making it easy to invoice us, all of these things that don't reproduce that kind of bureaucratic violence. We've also, a big tension has been how to speak these stories without it being incredibly like triggering for people who experience the violence of the welfare system, because we don't want the timeline and the podcasts, etc., to not be for people who have lived experience. We want it to have that, there to be a care in terms of people sort of listening to or engaging with or watching and being part of that work. So that's meant like making sure that we have like content notes and warnings throughout the podcast, so that trying to create choice in terms of people consenting to listen and prioritizing care when they're engaging with the work, but also not infantilizing people, like, and respecting that folks know themselves and their bodies. I think, and I guess another couple of things is we have really questioned all the way through, what are we counting as a death that relates to the welfare system? Because when you start to see welfare state violence in a bigger form, it means it goes a long way back before 2008, and connects to so many other forms of state violence that it kind of makes us question the parameters of what we mean by, like, a benefits related death, for example, as it often gets called. So, like, knowing that and holding that people's deaths are part of a much bigger context that include deaths because of being denied benefits due to immigration status, the deaths of incarcerated people within the so-called social care system, people who've died during the pandemic, and those people's deaths aren't often understood as, like, welfare related deaths, but they're really closely related to connecting forms of ableism, disableism, racism, classism, and that kind of state dehumanization of disabled people. So I suppose really trying to hold that bigger context in which deaths related to the benefits system are part of. And I think for me, a really big learning and maybe intention, I guess, a little bit, is that I think there's a really strong, understandable tendency to talk about people's deaths in the system and harms as flaws in the welfare system, and where there have been findings, legal findings of the Department for Work and Pension kind of being responsible in some ways for people's deaths, that it's usually around using words like flaws or mistakes. And I suppose for me, what I fear that misses if we reproduce that language of flaws and mistakes is that actually people's deaths may well be an outcome of the welfare system functioning exactly as it's designed to. So it isn't a flaw or a mistake, like that kind of harm is built into the system. It's a feature of it. It's not a bug. And I think that's a tension we hold in the project in terms of folks who imagine accountability to come through, like, state mechanisms, and then perhaps other folks, or sometimes the same people holding these views up at the same time, who imagine justice is something much kind of bigger, it's beyond the state, perhaps, not something that we're going to get within kind of state processes and structures.
Hello. I hope you enjoyed listening to past me talking to and hearing mostly from China Mills about the incredible Deaths by Welfare project, the range of the work they do. Really urge you to check them out. It was a real pleasure to hear from her and understand a bit more some of the ways that they're doing what they're doing over at Healing Justice London. One thing that we decided to do when choosing this theme as the Disability Justice Network was to ask around in our little collective and see what examples came to mind that people thought were really powerful when looking at creative ways people have resisted state violence or have amplified the issues that they've been experiencing. So we've got a little bit of a show and tell from three of our members, myself, Siobhan and Misha, about three examples of work we think you should get to know. So please enjoy.
Theatre called Brassic FM that is currently on at the Gate Theatre in London until the 30th of September. It is a fantastic piece of art that is exploring working class culture and music. It explores the violence and oppression of the state and the effect of that on people, on communities, on all of our lives. It is a wonderful celebration, but also a questioning of the systems that are oppressing us all. It doesn't hold back. It is radical from the way that it is made through to the message that it's conveying. And it feels like a piece of work that really needs to be shared and experienced.
For me, a really exciting site of creative resistance is what are sometimes called mad zines. And zines are non-commercial, not-for-profit, community created and distributed magazines. They can sometimes be in written format, but they can also include art, illustration, collage. Sometimes they're very tactile, they're things that you can fold out into maps or pieces of artwork that don't necessarily resemble what we think of as traditional magazines. And I think that these are really exciting because, by virtue of how they're produced, they offer up alternative narratives to those that we usually see in traditional media about mental health and madness. So, for example, there are zines on things like self-harm. I'm thinking of a zine called Still Healing, which is on recovery from self-harm by a zine maker called Dogs Not Diets, where they write about self-harm from a harm reduction approach. So rather than like traditional psychiatry, which says, self-harm should be stopped and eradicated at all costs, this author takes a more nuanced approach that is informed by their own lived experience. So they talk about how to, for example, care for your self-harm wounds when you already have them, how to self-harm in safer ways if you feel that it is inevitable and the only way that you can cope. And they take a kind of gentler and kinder approach to self-harm, acknowledging that for some people stopping might not be a possibility right now, and it might be their only way of coping. Zines also are really personal and avoid kind of taking blanket approaches to care. So again, while NHS literature might say kind of this is the approach, this is what you must do, you must get therapy or take medication or do mindfulness, zines offer up more subjectivity, and they offer up interpretation to the reader or the viewer. So for example, in this zine, Still Healing, the author says, what works for me might not work for you. It might be the opposite of what works for you. And I think that offers up the possibility of plurality and acknowledges that our lived experiences are also different, and there is not one silver bullet that is a kind of cure-all for all of our struggles. And I find that a really liberating approach, which acknowledges the messiness of our experiences.
So the works that come to mind for me are ones that are able to balance both calling to attention the volume and scale of state violence with also honouring people who've been affected and their individual experiences and livelihoods. AIDS Memorial Quilt is a particularly notable one. I think it's the biggest piece of collective textile art in the world, and it's started connecting the names of people whose lives were lost at the beginning of the AIDS crisis. Initially in San Francisco, people who weren't able to get funerals and people whose lives were lost because governments simply were refusing to step in and give people the care they needed in order to survive and have their lives saved. But I think we see this at a lot of different scales, related to a lot of different ways that governments, states and healthcare systems simply let people get sicker, let people lose their lives through just sheer inaction. The Millions Missing protests, I think, are a really important example of how we can allow people to show up who aren't able to physically show up, and how we can call to attention the very disabling nature of energy limiting chronic conditions that mean that people aren't able to participate in day-to-day life as many other people would expect. So putting the shoes out and showing the scale of people that should be stood in a space if they were able to, and if they weren't left to be sick and without adequate care by governments. So from a few examples that we think are really important, we're moving on now to an interview with an incredible artist who's going to talk us through some of his work that is along very similar themes. I'm going to hand over to Dennis, who's going to talk to Vince about his work. So over to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Edie. That was so powerful. And the videos that people were showing of the different artists that they've been appreciating. and also the interview with China Mills, absolutely fascinating. So we're running around 10 to 12 minutes over time, everyone. But if you can bear with us, we are going on quick time. So I would like to introduce you next to the wonderful Vince Law. Vince is a poet, an artist, and an activist whose work I've been admiring for years. And for anyone, just again, we need a content note here to sensitive topic. For anyone that's been a disabled person for more than about 5 minutes, we have lost someone to state violence in the last, really since 2008. We all know someone we've lost. Like I lost a friend, Neela, 18 months ago. And it is, I think it's really important. China was saying this is deliberate oppression and choice, choice. But what I think is really important is that we commemorate and honour the people that we've lost. And that's why I think talking to you today, Vince, is so important, because I think your work, although some people might think it's a bit grim, I think it really, really does that. And it honours the people that we've lost, and it records some of what's been going on. So, yeah, we're especially interested in your artistic response to this violence inflicted by the state. So I'm going to kick off by asking you, Vince, would you mind telling us a little about how your project with the Shrouds came about? Because that's focused partly on the DWP, isn't it?
Yes. Well, hello, Dennis, and hello, everybody. Yes, I've made a series of what I call shrouds, and they're titled DWP Deaths Make Me Sick Shrouds. And I do a thing as an artist where I try to title my work sometimes so that you can tell just from the title what it's all about. Because then even if people don't want to show or talk about it, they kind of have to mention that in, reporting on it and what have you. But anyway, I wrote a play. A version of the Faust myth. And in this myth, John Faust was battling the DWP. The DWP was benefits from hell, and Lucifer was in control of the DWP. But fortunately for John Faust, who had his benefits stopped suddenly without any reason, something I've had happen to me twice, he tries to throw himself off the highest peak in Norfolk, which isn't very high, but even so. And Lucifer she stops him from committing suicide because she likes the poetry book he's working on so much. So she finally persuades him to sign a contract, which means that she will look after him, he will finish his book, and suddenly he feels fit for work. Yee! And in the second half, he goes off and he goes to Parliament, gives the Prime Minister a piece of his mind, meets the Pope in space, and puts the world to rights, really. So when I was making that piece of work, that was 2017 in Norwich with about 13 volunteers. And I needed a set. I needed something to dress the stage with, something that felt appropriate. And I'd already worked with the Black Triangle campaign. I'd taken some of they keep a list of names of people who have been who have died due to DWP violence and what have you. Here are some of the shrouds up on the screen now, and these then hung across the back of the set. And also when people came into the theatre, they were hanging outside the theatre. There's 3 in this image, but I've actually made 25 so far. And what I did was I set them out a bit like a poem, a bit like a concrete poem. So the title of the poem is the person's name. And then the information and the details I took from public records. So they were all in news reports. So they are factual. And I deliberately didn't dress them up in any way. I didn't say this is appalling, this is terrible. I just gave the facts. And I know when I finished spray painting the first one. They're made with spray paints using stencils on old bedding, recycled bedding. And I knew when I'd made one that they just were very powerful. And I like the fact that they're all about 6 foot by 4 foot, which I figure is about the size of a burial plot.
Yeah.
And they're made, using spray paints and stencils. And they take 2 or 3, 4 days to make. And it's a bit of a journey making it. I often get quite emotional making them, quite weepy making them, and quite defiant and angry at different turns. And I made them for this play set, and then when then we got some funding from Unlimited and put it on the following year, bigger and better with more glitter and glamour. And then in 2019, I'd finished that project, but I thought these shrouds needed to be seen and deserved to be seen and were powerful objects in their own works in their own right. So they've been traveling all over the country. I've made about 25. They've been in exhibitions in London, in Norwich, in, I don't know, name a city. They've been there.
Manchester. I saw them in Manchester.
Yes.
And it was absolutely breathtaking. And I'd seen lots and lots of pictures of them, but I really would, for anyone that does get an opportunity to see Vince's shrouds on tour, I really would recommend going to see them. It was awe-inspiring. It was very emotional, because
I think they're powerful pieces. Yeah, sure. You had China Mills on earlier, and she's got an exhibition curated in Brixton coming up in October, November. And there will be, I think there's half a dozen there, plus a great big banner which says "Dead People Don't Claim." And that was the banner we used on protest, but also used it as Lucifer's cloak when we put on the play. So that gets brought in, Lucifer's wearing it, and all the other paupers are cloak bearers and come in and then hold that up right at the start of the play. So yeah, that's kind of the work that's where they came from. And I've done a lot of different things. I know you're going to show some other images. We might not talk about them specifically, but I've done quite a lot of different forms of protest about this. And in fact, there's the big society begging bowls when I think it was David Cameron, wasn't it, who wanted us all to it's always about do things for nothing. They want everyone to volunteer, and they want everyone to help everyone, as long as the state doesn't have to spend our money helping us, basically. Kind of don't get me started, but I'm on here to get started, so do. And I'm just tackling at the moment. I've just been commissioned to do a very queer King Lear. So I'm working on that and thinking about madness and thinking about patients who are psychiatric and don't always have the voice that they should have for themselves. So I'm thinking about that, and hopefully there'll be something on that next year. And the year after, if I'm successful in a funding bid, who knows, it's a lottery. With luck, the Faust project may go on tour in 2025. I'm just applying to put that on. I've reduced the cast to 5 members, and I'm hoping to employ 5 disabled actors who can then tour it. Not because all the parts need disabled actors, but because disabled people can play any part. So I just think it would be a great thing, and I'm hoping that fingers crossed that comes together, and application writers and application acceptors accept that, and that might happen in 2025.
Oh, that's so amazing to see some of the stuff coming up. And again, this is amazing. This banner that we can see at the moment says "Disabled people being killed by Tory policies enforced by the DWP," which I think says it all. Vince,
yes.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was exactly what China was talking about earlier, and about this idea that there are flaws in the system. I mean, I started off thinking that when I first started protesting, and after about 3 or 4 years, the penny just dropped. These people don't want to change this system. As far as they're concerned, this is the system and it's working fine. Thank you very much. I made up an Oscar Wilde quote, which goes, "If the system cripples you, you must cripple the system." There we go. I'll shut up now.
Oh, I love that. Vince, I could literally interview you all day about all your different works. It has been such a joy having you on the show. I can't thank you enough. Just thanks for joining us live. So before we finish your interview, is there anything you want to tell people about where they should go to find out more about your work?
Well, there's a Facebook page called DWP Deaths, and I think the title is DWP Deaths Make Me Sick. But yeah, you can look that up. You can contact me on there. You can get me on the email. I also blog on Disability Arts Online. If you go on there, I'm sure you can contact me via that. So those shrouds are available. I'd rather they went off and got displayed all around the country. There's no point in them sitting in my house. I know what they're all about. So if anybody's got an exhibition coming up, get in touch. And thank you very much for this opportunity, and all power to everybody involved with it. Oh yeah, well, you can't not end without these two. This is Badger and Badger, and I had a neighbor move in, and strangely enough, my dog was called Badger on the right, and her dog was called Badger, so that was a bit weird. But yeah, when people were doing the dog shaming cards around the neck, I just thought this was rather a nice touch. I pooed on a Tory's lawn, I made him do it.
Yeah, definitely a badge of pride, that. Thanks once again, Vince. You've just been amazing. And so
Thanks,
now,
Dennis.
to close up, I'm going to hand over to the lovely Shabazz Mohammed.
Thank you, Dennis. And before I do the usual housekeeping, as soon as this is our last pilot show, I would like to just take a few moments to just say a few words in terms of the overall project. And as I've been watching this show today, it's been really powerful, really emotional, and really inspiring. And to take everybody back to where this all begun was about disability justice. And throughout watching this particular show today, I've just been thinking about disability justice, and I just wanted to say that this is never party political, for me at least, and these are my views, but it's never party political. To me, this is all about governments in the future or governments of the past. It's about any future government any country ever has. They need to consider disabled people as a group of people. Just because we've got varying disabilities doesn't mean we can't be thought of as people and as a normal voting bloc. So I just wanted to say that any government going forward needs to look at the foundations of a society, and I believe that to be one of the foundational pillars of a society is a welfare state, and is the NHS, and is the immigration policy. And that's my little speech over. But before I go on to the housekeeping, I would also like to thank TWT for helping us do this and allowing us to do this, and hopefully you'll work with us again in the future, and we'll do other shows with or without you, because that's the kind of people we are. And anyway, on with the housekeeping now. So the TWT Festival's just around the corner, and all the links will be on screen below. And you can still buy tickets, you can still volunteer. And there was two bits of the festival we wanted to direct everybody to, which one was a panel discussion titled Disability Possibility, and the other one was, let me just check the notes, it's called Access Hack. So yeah, and that's all the housekeeping done, and all that remains for me to say. And Dennis can join me if she likes, or if they like. And thank you everybody for watching, and goodbye everyone. See you again soon.
Hope to see you soon, folks.
Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.